Hello, my name is Michael Halsey. I'm going to be teaching the course, this course, BE 306, the intertestamental period, and also we will be studying the four Gospels. When we come to the four Gospels, we have to recognize some things in their culture back in their day that is different from our culture today regarding biographies. First of all, we need to set the stage by saying that these Gospels have been described as theological biographies. Now, that's true. They are biographies. But the thing is, they're not biographies like we think of biographies in the West. When they use these different biblical authors use the term, or we use the term for them, biographies. When we look at the four Gospels, take, for example, the temptations of Christ. If you look at those, they're not in the same order in different Gospels. Question is, why is that? The reason is because, as we're going to study, they're not writing a biography like we write a biography, necessarily in chronological order. But we're going to be taking a long look at that in this course. Another thing we have to recognize about these Gospels, these quote-unquote biographies, is that they're not written to satisfy the reader's curiosity. The way we know that is because the authors either state their purpose or we glean their purpose from looking at the contents of their book. For example, John writes for a particular purpose, and he states it right at the conclusion of his record of Christ's life. He says, "These things are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, that is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life through his name." All right, that's his purpose. His purpose is not to satisfy our curiosity and just simply to amass facts about the life of Jesus Christ. Now, when we come to think about why study these Gospels, the reason is, and the major reason is, because of course it is God's revelation, but it is God's revelation of the words, the deeds, and the events in the life of a person, capital P, who fundamentally changed the world like no one else has ever changed the world. That's the important reason why we are studying these Gospels. Unfortunately, not all that much attention has been given to a verse-by-verse teaching of the Gospels in ministries. Of course, we're not going to have time to get into a verse-by-verse study, but I hope that our study will encourage you to not only examine the Gospels, but also to teach through each of these Gospels. I mentioned that each Gospel author has a purpose, and it's a different purpose for writing about the life and times of Jesus Christ and what he did. For example, Matthew will write to present to the Jewish reader, and he is writing primarily to the Jewish reader because he quotes from the Old Testament more than any other Gospel author. He's writing to Jews who would be familiar with their Bible, as they would have called it back then. And he's writing to explain things. He's writing for the purpose of pointing out and assuring the believing Jews who are reading his record. He's writing to assure them that, yes, the Messiah has come. Yes, the Messiah did offer the kingdom, but no, Israel rejected his offer. Now, if you were a Jewish reader reading back then, your first thought would be, well, what now? Well, what are we supposed to do now? The offer has been rejected. What's going to happen? Matthew writes to explain all that. When Mark comes to write, his purpose is totally different. He wants to present this perfect person, the Son of God, as the servant of Jehovah. His book is a book which, once it started, it moves, and it moves quickly. It's the shortest of all the gospel records. And so Mark will present Jesus as servant of God, the one who came, as he says in Mark 10:45, the one who came not to be served, but to serve. Then when we come to Luke stating his purpose. His purpose is to write in consecutive order the facts of Jesus' life so as to assure the readers that he is the Son of God, just like Matthew wants to show that Jesus is the Son of David, who came to fulfill the covenants and the offer of the kingdom, so forth and so on. But Luke wants to show Jesus as primarily what he does is emphasize in his gospel forgiveness of sin. Over and over, he will intersperse instances of forgiveness of sin and salvation. He wants to set an order for the reader that he addresses, as well as all readers, the true facts, he says, after examining eyewitnesses and so forth. These are the true facts, and I want to assure you that these are the true facts of Jesus of Nazareth as the Son of God. Now, the gospel records are important, as I said, for that primary reason. But there's also another reason, and that's a study of bibliology in and of itself. For example, if we didn't have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Old Testament just hangs there. It's not complete. What happened? So it completes the Old Testament in the sense of fulfilling the Old Testament prophecies of the first advent of the Messiah. But not only that, when we come to the remainder of the Bible, the remainder of the New Testament, the gospel records, if we don't have them, well, what is all this? What's going on? There's no firm basis, in other words, for the grace age, for the church age. Where did this thing called the church come from? Well, it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that tell us. Something else about the four Gospels that's very important when we study them is to recognize that they are Christocentric, that Jesus is the focus of the four Gospels. There is a tendency in our modern day to read ourselves into the narrative, to read the people we teach into the narrative, and to put the focus on us. That's not the focus of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The focus is Jesus of Nazareth. What did he say? What did he do? What was his purpose? And so when we read these gospel records, we want to always ask for every text that we study, what does this text teach us about Jesus, the Son of God? Not what does this text teach us about Peter or John or anybody else that comes into contact with Christ. That's taking the focus off what the authors or who the authors want us to focus on, and that is Jesus Christ. We'll take up such important things as questions that have puzzled believers for generations. For example, the puzzling aspect of the ending of the Gospel of Mark. It ends in a very strange way, as many have pointed out. Well, in other words, we want to look at various things that are puzzling, questions that come up about the Gospels. Not only the ending of Mark, but also statements that are made, statements that Christ made. For example, he said on one occasion, "Let the dead bury the dead." Well, what does that mean? What is he talking about? In order to understand the texts, the writings of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we have to go back to the Old Testament. We have to go back to the first century culture, see what it was like back then. Again, a problem we have, and we can't help it, is to read our culture back into their day. And that leads us to many a false conclusion. We also, in answering these questions, have to examine not only the Old Testament, not only the first century culture in which they lived, but also the context of each of the texts that we're going to study. Now, we're also going to take a look at the intertestamental period, and our main focus there is going to be on Galatians 4:4. In the fullness of time, that is, when time was ready, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, made under the law. And we're going to be taking a look at that 400-year period from the standpoint of how was God moving in that period? What was going on in the secular world during that period in order to prepare for the coming of the Son of God? That's basically an overview of the course. I look forward to seeing you in class, and you can enroll in that course by going to the Chafer Seminary website. So I'll see you in class.